spirit. We must be a team.
Business is war. It's dog eat dog, rat eat rat.
You gotta have a problem.
Hi, I'm William Bryant, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about cost management. Now, I always think it's kind of interesting because obviously you're looking at managing costs, right? You want to spend the least amount you possibly can because then you get your best margin by doing so. But essentially you're trying to track, hey, what have we paid in the past for various materials or services or what have you, and has that changed and how is that impacting our operations and of course our bottom line. And you also want to know where those costs came from and if they're warranted or not. And so costs, they just have so many categories that can be really confusing for people. You run from prime costs, which are your direct materials and direct labor only, to direct costs, which are all costs that are traceable to a given product or service provided, and then you've got, of course, full costs, right, or full absorption costing, which you use for COGS. There's just so many definitions that it can kind of seem daunting as you're going through it, and so I kind of look at it where, all right, let's run this basis and try to build up and figure out what are costs and what are we looking to manage. Costs come from essentially two places when you're running ops, right? They're coming from outside the company, things that you're paying for, like materials, outsourcing, pretty much anything that runs through procurement, a lot of your AP. And those are prices that you could consider that are those producer prices, if you ever look at the PPI to kind of analyze, if prices are anticipated to increase, especially for industry or something. And so those prices you have less control over. Certainly you can do the make or buy decision analysis to figure out, hey, do we outsource or do we do this internally, and for all kinds of different areas and operations, not just for maybe a component that you're running in a manufacturing process, but everything from outsourcing certain activities that you're conducting in different departments. As far as material cost goes, and you're actually running sourcing, you also have sometimes a limited number of sources that you can make those purchases from. You're also a little bit strapped into, especially if it's like a commodity, you're strapped into market pricing. If you, right now is a good example. If you're relying on silver for your product, unless you ran maybe some forward contracts, you get silver at a better price. You're kind of at the whim of the market to do your replenishment right now. And so external pricing that you're paying, and obviously are your costs, you have a little bit less control over, but you still want to be able to identify that that's where those increases came from. And so you're managing more by observation and planning in that respect. Then you have the other aspect of the cost, which anything that occurs within your value chain, right? Once it enters your walls, think of it, as a structure, those are the costs that you control from within, which are primarily looking at efficiency, right? Your productivity, utilization of time, and be it, you're thinking on billable, non-billable hours, you're doing idle time on machines versus productive time, things like that. And on that granular level, that's what you're looking at. So when you're discussing your cost management, how you actually go about, creating your benchmarking for a particular process and saying that, this is the anticipated cost in, I prefer time metrics because quite frankly, the time is money concept is absolutely true. Everything is measured in time, and it doesn't really matter, whatever other charge you put into it, it's always going to come back to time. For example, this is going to be kind of an extreme example, but think about your rent, okay? Now, even if you're open 24 hours, you don't necessarily make money over that entire period of time, but the fact is that your rent that you pay for a month if you were to break it down on an hourly rate, think about your idle time and the utilization for the amount of time you're closed versus the amount of time you're open. I mean, you can't make any money when you're closed. And technically speaking, if you were to break it down on an hourly basis, you're still paying for that time. I mean, that's an extreme case, but I sometimes think extreme cases get the point across quite well. And so when you think of costs on an internal basis, that's what it is. It's all time. It's the same thing. You're paying employees who are there on an hourly rate, whether they're doing the activity or not. Hence, where it comes into the utilization of or productivity of their hours. And then, of course, it goes into efficiency and throughput. Like, for example, in a manufacturing process, how many units are you able to put through in a given amount of time? Because that is really a bottleneck to what you're able to send out to whoever is purchasing. If you've done batch orders and somebody orders a batch, well, the faster you get that out to them, then obviously the faster you can start another batch. And so that ends up being the bottleneck to your revenues. So when you're looking at costs, it's important to consider what exactly are we looking at to measure relative to some metric. And that's why I always kind of say time. Now, if we roll this up, because all of these activities, essentially you've got what? Variable costs and fixed costs, which I always like going back to these things because they end up being pretty easily understood. And they roll up nicely into your contribution margin statement, which is slightly different than obviously your income statement. And you've got two different methods for measuring costs then, all right? Now, when you're doing the contribution margin method and you're just looking at variable costs that are associated to something in a process, and you can nicely segment it, and you can actually trace all those variable costs to whatever product or whatever service or whatever you're providing, and then do your allocation of overhead that way, it's a little bit different than what you're actually going to do if you were to do it from your GAAP standard statements. And the reason being, if you think of GAAP and we go back to cost of goods, which is your full absorption costing, GAAP does, of course, your direct materials, direct labor, and an allocated overhead. And, if that wasn't enough to kind of like make your head spin, right? There are different ways that you can do that. A lot of people would just consider, okay, normal costing, where you're using actual material and actual labor, actually what you paid for it, and I mean, you can get into all of the rest of, LIFO, FIFO, and weighted average cost and all the rest of that goes with the inventory. But when you're looking at actual material and actual labor, and then what it does is you've got a predetermined rate for your overhead, but it's allocated to the actual activity that you've done over the period. And so where you don't really have any variance at all in the materials and labor because you're doing actual tracking, you can still have a little bit of variance because your rate and your activity may be slightly different for the period if you're over or under by a little bit, and then you have to make those adjustments. But that ends up being your cost of goods for the period in a normal costing. And a lot of people would think of it that way because you would think of doing, what did I actually pay for these materials and labor, okay? And the other way you could do it, you could do standard costing, where you actually do a rate. And so you just do kind of like a predetermined rate for the materials and a predetermined rate for the labor. And that rate relative to whatever the activity was and whatever the amount of materials, typically like weight or volume or something. And that becomes your total for the period. Obviously, you can have variance there in either of those categories. And then at the same time, the overhead allocation, you're actually running a rate against an anticipated amount of production. And so you have potentially a lot of variability. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because you actually get to see, where the variance was. And depending on what your operations is, sometimes you don't have a choice. One is more complex than the other. But as you can see, that is very different method of tracking your costs when you roll them up on an accounting statement than if you look at them more on a contribution margin perspective where you're actually just trying to do the variable costs, or you just say, forget all that, let's do time-driven activity within a segment and try to track costs that way. And so when you're talking cost management and you're trying to assess these things, it's important to try to get in and say, okay, well, what are we actually going to do and what are our measurements going to be relative to, the accounting statement, to the activity in the, process or the function, or how are we going to do this? Because costs, there's a depth of them in how you measure them and what you're going to put together. So the interesting thing about using the standardized basis is that using standard costs kind of presents a way to do a variance that's already structured within your cost system, and you can actually do your costs analysis and management that way. Because when people think of cost for, say, materials and labor, they don't really think of it more granularly than that. And the interesting thing that goes into it is that obviously material can be divided into the amount of material necessary to actually complete the project and the price that you had to pay for that material. So you've got those dual aspects underneath the direct material cost itself. The same thing goes for labor. You've got the rate that you had to pay for that labor, but then you also have the time that it took for that labor to complete the task. And so you've got these undercurrents, even more granular and more rooted below this. And this adds that root cause scenario where you say, hey, if our material was too much, then what was the reason for it? Was it because we used too much material, or was it because the price we paid? And it's the same thing for the labor. You can figure out, well, what happened in the labor? Did it take them too much time? Why did it take them too much time? Was it somebody who was, kind of in training and didn't really understand what they were doing? What happened? And so you get granular answers, from that standardization. And of course, you can do that in any system, but including the activity-based. But if you're already doing it in a certain method in order to do your costs for your inventory, you can actually utilize that in your cost management structure. And then beyond that, you get into other costs where you're looking at, for example, if material costs were really high and it wasn't the price that you paid, it was actually because you got bad materials. Well, there's 4 other areas of costs you can actually put together and assess. You can look at internal failure, external failure, appraisal costs, and preventative costs. And so internal failure costs are those things like reworks that have to be done. External failure would be things like warranty service costs, which obviously have other costs that go along with them, because dissatisfied customers, that's somewhere down the line you're probably going to sacrifice sales. The appraisal cost would be the actual monitoring or the time it takes to inspect the materials when they come in. So perhaps you're able to reject cheaper materials if that was to be an issue with materials. And then the preventative costs going into routine maintenance and all of those kinds of things that keep things in operations flowing smoothly so you don't have idle time costs that go on. And so when you're looking at a cost management system, you really have to kind of start defining all of these different things. What costs are we going to measure? How are we going to measure it? What are we going to compare it to? There are a lot of things that go into this, and the way you define it is kind of key. And really understanding how those costs are structured is also key before you even begin. And so, obviously this is an in-depth topic and you can get very deep into it. And so I really just kind of wanted to strike the surface on, talking about cost and cost analysis because it's a fascinating subject, but one where you do need to have a solid foundation to kind of begin the process. And that's time. But anyway, thank you very much. Bye.